Hi, everyone. How are you all doing? It's good to see everyone. Thank you so much, Leslie, for that beautiful introduction, and to Omar for inviting me and making the arrangements. In hearing the description of the talk today, it's not going to really go like that. I've decided to kind of focus on territories and go through quite a bit of art and cultural production. I wasn't quite ready to move to the sea edge and to think about the oceanic. We could talk about that in Q&A, or we could think about that later. But really, my work and my big objectives in both the extractive zone and beyond the pink tide are to think about, is that too loud? Oh. Okay, there we go, mood lighting. So great, I can still see my words, that's good. So I wanted to really start by thinking about the objectives from those two books. Two recent books, one, The Extractive Zone, published 2017. I didn't quite feel like I had gotten all of the material in that book. There was a kind of excess. I needed to think more. I needed to stretch my social and political vocabularies, and that led to Beyond the Pink Tide that just actually came out. And for me, it's really important for us at this moment, right, to find a kind of new conceptual and theoretical language for the old and new face of global capitalism, and really to find sources of inspiration. There's a lot of negativity, and what does it mean to think about critical hope? So I hope to kind of both show you landscapes of ruin, but also think about these spaces as offering us something, offering us potentially something like critical hope. So for me, I'm really interested in navigating the kind of sliver edge, right, between state and corporate power on the one hand that has an excessive rule over our lives and the planet. So on the one hand, there's corporate and state power, global capitalism, lots of big structures. On the other, I'm thinking about things like submerged perspectives, embodiments, questions of epistemes, and all those things are helping us navigate the logics of inevitable planetary ruin, or so they say, right? It seems really critical now that we center the role of artists, scholars, and activist writers in terms of the ways in which they have something substantial to say to us, and we have to work together from different perspectives in what's becoming the kind of transitional economy or wide-scale social and economic transformation. Part of the way we might think about that is to think about global revolution, okay? Global revolution. I'm kind of calling for that today. But since the term global is kind of overdetermined and revolution has a lot of baggage, maybe instead I'll talk about how we create the texture for imagining decolonial futures. Part of this imaginary includes decolonizing indigenous territories and contending with anti-Black racisms and other forms of devaluation. For me, global revolution and decolonial futures in this lecture are synonymous, given that we must insist that we have a future, not only as a human species, but as a planet. I say that because this runs pretty contrary to many of the reports we're hearing, even in the New York Times of the last few days. And if the political right is embedded within a global climate change structure of denial, that we also might call capitalism, the liberal mainstream and the political left is just as culpable, I would say, for constantly predicting the end without contending with the effects and outcomes in very particular places in local geographies. You are studying gentrification, that becomes really essential in urban places. I'm going to show you kind of the peripheries of that face, right, of capitalism. Really, this is a privileged position, I would say, and it also ignores indigenous communities and those dependent upon natural resources and their sustainable economies. It also ignores the suffering in the aftermath of environmental collapse, not to come, but that has already come. In such spaces, the apocalypse has already arrived. Given that Indigenous Peoples Day was yesterday, let me stick on this point for a minute. Decolonial futures is not only about returning lands as redistributive justice for indigenous peoples, but also about how to perceive and how to overturn structural inequities writ large, in part by taking indigeneity seriously, not as primitivism, romanticism, or some kind of salvation narrative. And sometimes when people engage with my work, I see how much that tendency continues to be enlivened, right? but really as practices of survival, as endurance, as refusal, from within the colonial condition of racial capitalism, from within the occupied forests, from within over-extracted territories of sea, river, mountains, and underground reserves of gas and oil. So if we heed the call then of global indigenous movements, and I'll talk today about hemispheric movements, then we are actually forced to demilitarize occupied territories. We're forced to rethink the meaning. I'm going to have this problem now, huh? Let me just make sure. Okay, I'll try to hit it every now and then to make sure. So if we actually listen, I was saying, to indigenous movements, to indigenous spaces and what people are saying there, we have to demilitarize those spaces. We have to rethink the meaning of property and propriety. And if we listen carefully to the real proposals coming from those places, right, then we would consider things like shared governance between the settler and indigenous peoples. We would think about something like radical interdependence. And we would also think about different forms of perception that you're studying right here and thinking with at Cooper Union. We then therefore would have many more ideas about how to make broad-based changes amidst environmental collapse. And I'm saying, in fact, we're not engaging with that, or we would have kind of solution-based responses, right? So if you read my book, The Extractive Zone, or at least parts of it, as some of you have, you'll know that I do not subscribe to any kind of linear temporality of change as the progression narrative of revolution would have it, nor do I see transformation as episodic. Instead, I'm drawing from something much broader, the work, for instance, of Aymara intellectual Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui from Bolivia, who actually considers something else in relationship to transformation. She sees it as a horizon of activity, right, where memory and the future are imbricated in a dynamic timescape of past, present, future. There is no future to come. The past and the present and the future are all kind of dynamically entangled. And it's really hard for us to imagine in the heart of post-colonial Manhattan this kind of timescape where everything is about what we do right now and tomorrow. But of course, right here are the layers of Lenape indigenous presence that continue to mark another path of development that does not necessarily normalize New York City as the center of global trade and finance, okay? So that's part of the setup, and I want to suggest that we look then to something like indigenous survivance to tell us about the powerful story of permanent resistance. And this is something that actually I'm working in similar directions to Diné's scholar Glenn Coulthart, who's writing about the relationship of global revolution and indigenous movements. So my own work then, and what I want to talk about today, it thinks really hemispherically and comparatively about indigenous territories and anti-extractive organizing and the aesthetics, right, within those spaces to consider where catastrophe has already occurred. So here are a number of questions for us to think about today and for me to kind of try to begin to answer. What is the role of art and representation in revealing and deferring the Earth's scars and the destruction within local communities? Can we imagine a timescape beyond the Anthropocene, right? The term for human-led intervention that dates back to the 15th century in colonialism. Are there aesthetic and political strategies that we might use that do not immediately fold us back into the extractive view? What do I even mean by the extractive view, right? The extractive view is how corporate capitalism and late colonial financialization organizes power and technologies to extract precisely from biodiverse indigenous territories. It historically takes from Black and brown communities in the global north and urban and rural spaces in the global south to dispossess, to gentrify, to ransack, and to deplete. It produces marginalization. It's not just naming marginalization, it actually does the production of marginalization by first commodifying resources and then taking from those spaces. It uses digital technologies like drones, the satellites, heat sensors, digital mapping, surveillance, classification, and the techniques of social sciences to rule over biodiverse indigenous spaces. Like, we could talk about the term biodiversity, which I think is really interesting. There's a lot of controversy right now over that term. Biodiversity is everywhere, but the spaces I'm talking about are acutely biodiverse or intensely biodiverse, if that makes sense. Of course, the analog in communities of color, say, in terms, is the extractive view of real estate financiers that mark out the next wave of gentrification. So extractive capitalism names the ongoing expansion of the colonial condition that is increasingly militarized. You see it, you go to these communities, you see how the army marches in and who's held accountable to this kind of violence. And it continually steals and appropriates from resource-rich areas. So that's part of what I'm interested in thinking about, this new last land grab. We are in a moment when there's an intensification of processes that have existed since the colonial period, and you see the roving kind of technologies, right, of the corporate state, a fierce land grab of capitalism, where we can start to talk about the last oil, right, the last water, the last forests. It is that dire. So, though I focus on the kind of long resource plundering of South America, the book more broadly points to the excavation and emptying out of social and ecological life as a planetary condition that accelerated after 1970s to dizzying levels by the 1990s and 2000s. From a Southern perspective, and that's a view I'm kind of trying to get into here, what is a Southern theory or a Southern perspective, a Southern eye? We might consider what it means to live and die in the shadow of capitalism, or in la sombra of extractive and racial capitalism. And of course, again, these spaces of occupation, be they Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Palestine, Sioux, the Mayan Quiche communities, Mapuche territories, and Canadian indigenous spaces, they've already experienced what supposedly will come for the rest of us. So again, what forms of refusal become necessary within these modes of death? How can we proliferate life in a non-reproductive way, okay? A non-normative way. So what I want to do then is turn to a number of examples from throughout the Americas that disorient us, that invert the extractive view, that dig beneath the extractive zone as partial and incomplete minor perspectives of what it means to live on the other side of catastrophe. So I want to talk then about things like choreographies and that performative kind of iteration. Inversion and what that means, right? Environmental testimonials. I'm calling the narratives that I'm hearing and that I'm seeing in different art productions as testimonials, but they're not of the human rights sense in that traditional sense. So what else do we call that genre? I'm also interested in what I'm calling submerged perspectives or edge play as counter aesthetics. And these counter aesthetics are doing a particular kind of work of how to live and contend within the Anthropocene. The work of mestiza multimedia Colombian artist Carolina Caicedo, an artist whose documentation of the Magdalena Cauca Valley region in Colombia I've written about extensively, has recently turned her video work and installation art to take stock of the disaster caused by the Itaipu Dam. The Itaipu Dam was constructed in 1973, although it took more than a decade to complete. There have been hundreds of subsequent floodings upon Guarani and Mestizo peasant territories along the Paraná River in Brazil over the last 45 years. In the film Agente Rio, Caicedo's eye shows us the muddied racial geographies of colonial extraction, and she uncovers painful collective testimonials of indigenous dispossession. She uses long pans and mid-level shots to visualize the massive flood trail. In a carefully crafted sequence that foregrounds the experience of disorientation by the local communities that have experienced this, a fisherman narrates how the Paraná River is now, quote, completely out of control, end quote. It rises unnaturally 8 or 9 meters each day, then dips below 2 feet of water the next. As a fisherman says, quote, the river moves too quickly and the fish loses his connection, end quote. Narrating the fish's disorientation during an early moment in the film, actually destabilizes an anthropocentric viewpoint and indicates the coming disaster, or the literal flooding without warning. As one displaced female resident tells it, the impending catastrophe was not foretold, as if to reference the dystopic worlds of Garcia Marquez. She says, it came at 4 a.m., and the dam's flood brought with it entire houses, cars, uprooted trees, mountainsides, animals, and people, with no warning by state officials of the immediate violence to come. After a series of such testimonials, we return to the voice of the fisherman, who reminds the viewer that, quote, before the dam, the river stayed stable, end quote. Caicedo's camera tracks between the disorienting movement of the river and the afterlives of the dam's destruction, where water lines rise and fall. With her, we see how the damming logic becomes a technocratic manager of surrounding life and death. As a fisherman puts it, quote, Itaipu does whatever it wants with the river, end quote. We can make a similar analogy here about how coloniality actually buries the histories of Guarani survival. It does whatever it wants with these territories. In Agente Rio, Caicedo gives us an unequivocal messages. Damming, be damned. The Itaipu Dam flooded more than 165,000 acres of Guarani territories and displaced at least 38 indigenous communities. In a move of amnesic settler erasure that can be tracked throughout the Americas as a strategy of colonial absorption, the Itaipu Corporation and the Brazilian state funded the Museum of the Guarani Land. Through false histories and romantic portrayals, the museum monoculture reductively celebrates indigenous culture and points to the wildlife reserves and its trails and the bird life. Part of the amnesia here is hiding the history of the Spanish and Portuguese mission system, right, that converted through Christianity, and the 1750 Madrid Treaty that documented the rationale for the removal of Guarani peoples from a growing mission economy at the time, forcibly dispossessing more than 80,000 indigenous peoples. So here, I'm really pointing then to the overlapping processes and temporalities on particular territories of removal and destruction, and how they produce an intensification of extractive infrastructures while expanding dispossession. You'll have Cecilia Vicuña come and lecture to you, and I now want to turn to her work. Turning to the northern Pacific coast of Chile, it turns out that the dialectic of memory and indigenous disappearance also shows up in her filmic work, especially in the 2012 experimental documentary entitled Concon. The film is a composite of 12 films, really, that I wrote about for her art catalog in About to Happen, and this accompanied her recent retrospective in New Orleans in 2017, and she'll probably let you know that she's done the same work for 50 years, and it's only now that she's getting any notice, right? In Concon, Vicuña situates herself within the ebb and flow of the tide in a kind of edge play, drawing the viewer's eye to that generative transitional space between land and sea. It seems important to make explicit that transitional spaces, like sea edges, are enlivened geographies, and that extractive capitalism doesn't really know what to do with these spaces between life and the conversion to death. To retrain the epistemological violence of our vision that reduces life to systems of commodities, or what I'm referring here as extractive view, Vicuña offers a kind of sonic and embodied visual homage to the Pacific Ocean and to the fragile micro-ecologies along the Concon beach that resides again within Chile's north-central coast. These here are provisional sculptures from found objects that insist on the level of the micro. By orienting to the sea, Vicuña calls attention to the nation's long coastline, almost an island situated as it is between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes Mountains and above the Patagonian archipelago. Against the suction cup, trans-Pacific, Canadian, US, Chinese, and Japanese fleets that have all but eliminated sea life in the area, converting the Pacific Ocean there into a gigantic extractive zone, Vicuña's directorial eye focuses on a smaller and edge-based scale, and also on partial bodily compositions, that hardly deviates in the range from closely cropped to medium-level shots. These close-up views reveal the plasticity and refuse in the sand, and Vicunia's ineffable ability to rework indestructible materials, where the toxic is reshaped into her world of play. The use of red paint on her hands and later tainting the ocean body red also makes reference to the red tides in southern Chile and throughout the global south now, really. This is the major event, right, of the ocean's toxification, acidification, and evidence of which is these bright red algae blooms. Something that Cecilia Vicuña shares with Caicedo's work that I just talked about, in fact, is that they situate their work in the currents between the effects and the energies of play, of pleasure, of pain and creation, amidst destruction, and then often along or with water bodies, be it the river or the ocean. This is what I'm calling something like edge play as the poetic, ecological, performative repertoire of decolonial practice. In the opening scene, Vicuña stunningly narrates, quote, "Since childhood, I played on these beaches. One day, I felt the sea sense me. In this instance, I knew the body and the sea dialogued in a language I needed to hear," end quote. Vicuña assigns the pronoun she to the Pacific, visualizing the ocean's capacity to reach out, to sense, and to orient towards other forms. This is what I call a kind of decolonial queer femme methodology, or her ability, and hopefully mine in some ways, to take in and be moved by the social environment as a porous method of specificity. And I would say that this allows actually for investigation into spaces and traces of coloniality. We can talk about that more if people are interested later. In the statement, "I felt the sea sense me," there's a decolonial queer method that moves in the interactivity between Vicuña and the Pacific Ocean body, scrambling the normativity of capitalism's flow and scrambling the thingification of the sea. Vicuña's edge play takes place on the beach in close proximity to where the Aconcagua oil refinery dumps its sludge into the Aconcagua River. Situated in the polluted cross currents, with the oil refinery in the background, she expands our critical imagination of what is to be done. As Christina Sharp recently put it in relationship to Black life, death, and the obstacles to breath, to go back to the question of the atmosphere, right? These are industrial polluted sites, and as she puts it, quote, "where material and metaphorical toxicity really come together," end quote. On the soundtrack, Vicuña narrates what cannot be seen above ground, namely that an Aconcagua sacred burial site underlies the oil refinery. And of course, this Aconcagua oil company is not just any oil company. It's the one that was behind the recent efforts to open up the Minnesota headwaters in the United States upon Ojibwe territories. And Ojibwe peoples have been in open conflict against extractive capitalism since 1880, with several periods of different kinds of threats. So I'm not saying that this is new. I'm saying that there is a layered history here that we have to pay attention to. And this layering is a kind of complex relay, okay, between burials and unearthings, and naming and renamings, and the circulation of capital as anchored over indigenous death. And this forces us to consider our own complicity. Let's see if I can get that going again. Okay, great. So these buried histories, what does it mean that there's this triple naming here of the Aconcagua by the oil company of indigenous peoples and disappearances and the burial ground and the river, right? We might consider what that naming practice is. And in that way, I think there's a regional history that she foregrounds that brings forward and also in a lot of ways rewrites the history of disappearance in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. Of course, you might have heard of the authoritarian period, the tortured and disappeared, but she's really thinking about the colonial disappearance of indigeneity and what that means and challenges for us now. In this way, I would suggest she reshapes historical memory and opens up avenues to decolonial futures. So, in turning to my next example of different visions and potentiality in this kind of model and thinking about decolonial futures or global revolution, I actually want to point us to the Marxist literature on social reproduction, the feminist literature on social reproduction that reminds us that the majority of global workers and those within the southern peripheries of epistemic difference live within the small spaces of capitalism. That is, there is no more formal work. What do we do when there's no more formal work? Marx would say that the workers would rise up, the proletariat would rise up, but we're in a moment, right, of informal work for 80% of the global population. This is often termed informal economies, and women, of course, make up the largest demographic of the informal economy. So, like the grounded and embodied viewpoints that show up in the work that I just showed you, from Carolina Caicedo to Cecilia Vicuña, I'm interested now in turning to the micro and the embodied through something called indigenous anarcho-feminisms. And I'm trying to suggest that that poses new alternatives to grounded material histories and allows us to see the labor that is active within the extractive zone. In Indígenas y Mujeres in Bolivia, Aymara theorist and historian, I've already referenced her, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, documents how Chola women, market women, posed alternatives to colonial capitalism and the mining economy through their powerful roles as brokers within the hybrid markets that were based on indigenous systems of horizontal trade. So here I'm interested in what would other kinds of markets look like, right? We're used to talking about cryptocurrency and potential alternatives, but we can go historically to the South, the South, the global South, and look at these potentialities. So throughout the 20th century, Cholas actually challenged middle-class pretensions and upper-class feminisms by raising issues such as this. Quote, in their work, they've said, couple violence and the need for a new morality is part of our work. We defend free love, we defend absolute divorce, and we reject civil marriage, end quote. How's that for a kind of radical agenda, right? In this moment that we're living in, all kinds of reactionary discussions. So for them, it's really important to think about these principles alongside an anti-capitalist vision. Local market spaces run by Chola women represent a kind of submerged network of activity within a wider global structure of a mining economy. This is what the mining economy got. Cerro Rico, the first site of silver extraction that fueled European industrialization, right? That mountain that was sacred to indigenous peoples is, a few years away from complete collapse. Entombed within it are the bodies of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples that were brought there to slave labor in the Mita system, right, to extract mining materials for that moment. So within this kind of discussion, I'm really interested in thinking about a radical history of feminist struggle. For instance, in June Nash's classic book, We Eat the Mines and the Mines Eat Us, that was in 1979, I think is a really relevant book. She raises the importance of domestic labor and slag pile mining work that's carried out by women and children and made invisible first by the state and then by a masculinist narrative of revolutionary history that writes out all of the work that women have done in this radical struggle, right? Writes out the kind of hunger strikes by those working in those spheres and toxic zones. Taking up this genealogy in the 1990s, 2000s, and continuing today is the work of a group called Mujeres Creando. In one particularly powerful performance, an Aymara woman stands in the middle of a tin container filled with water, and she washes her feet. The cityscape of La Paz stretches behind her. As she pauses, she looks into the camera and she directly says, "I am a Chola." In this direct address, she affirms her Aymara indigenous feminist positionality. In the next scene, the same member of Mujeres Creando addresses her own sexual preference by saying, quote, "It has been very lovely to be in the company of other women," end quote. She then declares herself heterosexual, recounting that it has taken her a very long time to make such a decision. Posed defiantly as she braids and unbraids and combs through her hair, she tells the story of how she met and decided upon being with her current partner. As she says, he needed to know that soy una chola diferente, soy una chola libre. I'm a different kind of chola, a free chola. And, quote, you will simply have to accept that. Now, you can't underestimate the kind of racism in these societies, especially against indigenous peoples, right? So that really became a very powerful cry. The Mujeres Video Archive represents a composite kind of approach that intertwines race and gender and class within a stratified public sphere. And it confronts a lot of expectations about Native traditionalism, about binarized gender spheres, and it also, tries to bring forward a kind of critique, a triple threat critique of capitalism, of mining, and of patriarchy. And so thus we have, you can't decolonize without depatriarchalizing, right? The important kind of refrain there. So for me, this is also part of the work. These are decolonial archives, I would call them, or places we can go to kind of make these larger claims about what is submerged within counter-aesthetics. At the same time, we can't think about these without, kind of considering histories and modes of art in the ways that I've been pointing to. I also want to suggest we might miss the point by thinking that these are small acts or small kinds of enactments, and they won't make a difference, right? How could these make a difference to the bigger machine? What if I were kind of to flip that idea, right, and say something else, and to say, what if instead the body or corporality is in fact one of the only obstacles to state and corporate violence? So in the last two examples, I want to turn to the work of two artists and activists whose work I really admire and that literally show us what it means to live and die in zones of occupation. In the America's Performance Archive, Guatemalan mestiza artist Regina Jose Galindo's embodied aesthetics demand accountability from the ravaging machine. In her performance Earth, Galindo presents her own small, naked, brown mestiza body as the last obstruction, or that which stands between her and obliteration of the natural world, obliteration of cultural memory, obliteration of planetary resources, and of the future. In a green landscape, Galindo's body stands in sharp relief to the devouring claws of the bulldozer against deep cleavages that threaten to engulf her. Here, her body is not the individual body, but the collective body. As Maya Quiche Rigoberta Menchú articulated, I is all of our we, okay? The bulldozer represents a kind of linear progress narrative, but there are also other things at work here, such as the carving out of burial sites all across Indigenous Americas, all across the kind of post-Cold War landscape. And also the ongoing continual genocidal extractive wars and feminicidal wars against female indigenous bodies. Galindo here is unflinching, and her refusal to move represents being stuck in the face of impending injury. It also forces us to reckon with our own complicity as we continue to witness the inevitable violence of the ravaging machine. In La Sombra, the short performance video that Galindo screened at Documenta 14, she continues to show us how the racialized gender body is both haunted and resists state impunity. In one long take, where Galindo is exhausted, literally exhausted, and she barely runs barely runs in front of the ravaging machine, a military tank literally chases her down for miles. The tank and the bulldozer recall here Palestinian erasure and counter-terrorist infrastructures that maim both land and bodies. So let's watch this. So this continues for several more minutes, and you see her getting more and more tired as, more and more exhausted in front of the military machine, right? But part of the problem there, or the question that she's bringing up, is that she's filming this in the forest surrounding Documenta in Kassel, Germany. And that, of course, was a site of a lot of military fabrication and the site of the military industrial industry during fascism. So she's recalling all of those layered histories, but then also pointing back to her homeland, to Guatemala and the kind of Cold War by the U.S., supported by the U.S. in Guatemala, and kind of entangling those moments there. Like Galindo, I too am obsessed with the bulldozer and the tank as twin symbols of dystopic developmentalism and as a prototypical weapon of violent amnesia within the paradigm of war. That's what we're living, a paradigm of war. It could be a paradigm of peace. It's not, right? So in my last example then, I want to turn to the work of Mapuche artist Francisco Huichaqueo and his haunting archive for the future. When he first screened this film, that I'll show you a very short clip of, in southern Chile at the Valdivia International Film Festival, there were only 5 people in the audience. I asked him about this and asked him what he thought, and he said, quote, "I'm not interested in showing this internationally or to thousands of people. I made this film as an archive for the future to show other indigenous Mapuche peoples the terrible and violent conditions we live through now," end quote. And when I've showed this and talked to people about this, they can't imagine that there's this kind of non-commodifiable idea of the future, right? That this doesn't have to circulate beyond the kind of present archiving for the future. So from within the occupied forest in southern Chile, Huichaqueo demands our attention. He calls upon the ancestors to think about, to haunt us, really, within the monocultural pine plantations of the Deep South. Gone are the trees. Those trees, the original trees, are now extinct that indigenous peoples made their life around the millennium forests of the past. And in their stead are these pine and eucalyptus forests, So it's a confused landscape. It's low budget. It's hard to understand what's happening. We're in a low view, and we're trying to see a forest. That's our view is blocked, right? Our view is blocked. We can't really see within the monocultural pines. And you see it says, our brown consciousness needs to come forward. Our ancestors come here. And he says, gives a cry, a wounded cry to the extinction of the forest, and then yells, "Pinos, pinos, pinos, eucalipto, eucalipto, eucalipto." We can't see our way out of the monocultural pine production because you've destroyed the territories. So this is the kind of haunting message that I want to leave you with from within the monocultural pine and eucalyptus plantations, to show you what it looks like, right? An environmental dystopia, what it feels like, how pervasive it is, and how it's not future-oriented, but already happened in the colonial past and the neoliberal here and now. But in the vein of critical hope, we have to look, listen, and act, and think about these layered mediations. And what what is it going to take, right? What is it going to take to shake us out of our derangement of this moment, shake us out of our alienation or the sense of hopelessness to create, I think, collectively this decolonial future? Well, I look again to some of the work that's being done with communities to suggest it's not just about land and water defense, but what it means to enact alongside the earth, alongside the river. We are not just the defenders of the river, we are the river, as the Asokimbo communities say in the face of hydroelectric damming. And together, part of this work is to think about what does it look like, what does post-extractive futures look like that aren't dependent on these kind of energy sources? What do we think about? Something like, instead of oil dependency and our complicity, something like radical interdependence with those living and dying within extractive zones. So I hope I haven't completely depressed you, instead have offered another way to think about time, space, geographies, and indigeneity. And also my goal is to say again that I do think there's something to be done, and it's done in these kinds of intersections as radical interdependence with artists, with new visions towards some imaginary that there is a decolonial future that's still possible. Thank you.